It's time once again for FoodSpace. All things food and drink, restaurants, travel, recipes, and cooking tips. There's something for everyone. Taste, sip, learn, and laugh along with us. And now it's time to get into his space, FoodSpace. Here's your host, Chef Michael Glatz.
Hello and welcome to FoodSpace, my space. Today we're going to call it Booze Space because we're going to talk about bourbon, which is one of my favorite beverages to drink, and that's what we do here on FoodSpace. We talk about travel, we talk about restaurants, we talk about different foods, cheeses, coffee. Today it's going to be about bourbon. And first of all, I want to thank Wayne and Sally here at Planet Vero. My producer and engineer for the show today. I have two special guests on the show today. Lynn Larkin, thanks for joining us today, Lynn.
Thank you.
Great. And Marie Bush, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Great. One of the fun things we do on FoodSpace is we do a lot of tasting right in front of you. To make you jealous, but also just really to have fun and sort of understand the flavors. One of my hashtags I use in social media all the time is expand your palate, hashtag expand your palate, because a lot of people say all the time, well, gosh, you know, I drink that coffee or I drink that wine and I don't taste all the things you taste. How come your tongue tastes things different than mine does? And the reality is I've been tasting my entire life as a chef, so I've developed my palate. And so that's what I encourage you to do, is to expand your palate by tasting. Taste before you drink, taste before you eat. That first sip or that first bite of everything you're going to put into your body, be a little analytical about it first. Taste it, and you'll find that you too will expand your palate. So today we're going to do bourbon. Now, bourbon is a whiskey, and all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. And it's got sort of a fun origins to its name. Whiskey comes from an English version of a Scots Gaelic word called uiscebheaga. And over time, uiscebheaga just got kind of shortened to whiskey. Plus, probably whiskey producers didn't want to put uiscebheaga on the bottle because nobody would buy it. So whiskey just made more sense. And you'll see oftentimes two different spellings of whiskey. One has an E before the Y and one does not. They are both correct, although traditionally whiskeys made in America will include the E before the Y, and whiskeys such as Scotch and Irish whiskey will not include the Y. But that's just sort of tradition. There's no really hard and fast rule about that. And so, as I said, bourbon is a whiskey, and whiskey is a spirit distilled from grain and aged in barrel. Easy. That's what it's all about. So what we're going to do, let's taste some whiskey. You gals want to taste whiskey first?
Yeah.
So I put out on my social media, who wants to taste bourbon? And I don't know, I guess I stereotyped and I thought a couple of big cigar-smoking burly guys were going to volunteer to come on the show today and taste bourbon, but I'm really happy to have you both, Maria.
Well, yeah, Maria, anyway.
It's so exciting to have you both here today. And I decided, you know, we could have tasted 50 bourbons today because there's so many great bourbons out there, but then we never would have been able to get home.
Right.
Would we? So I focused on two of my favorites that I think are going to be incredibly different, because the whole idea is to expand your palate, right? To get you to understanding flavors a little bit. So let's sip a little first, and then we'll talk about them as we sip. Here's what I encourage you to do. Have a little water to put in your mouth first.
Okay.
It will refresh your palate.
Okay.
Right? Kind of cleanse your palate, cool it off a little bit. Swish it around, swallow it. Don't be analytical about your water. Hopefully it has no flavor, no aroma, no taste, right?
Thank goodness.
And we're going to taste our first glass, which is your one on the left. And this is Angel's Envy. This is straight Kentucky bourbon, finished in port wine barrels.
Ooh.
And
smell good.
Give it a good smell first. And always when you taste, a little sip, then step back for a second and go in for a second sip. And you'll taste a little bit more on your second sip, generally speaking, right?
Ooh. Oh, is that smooth?
Very smooth, really wonderful. Bourbons are just great sipping spirits, you know, spirits for different occasions, right? We're out by the poolside, it's a hot summer day, we want to drink sangria, we don't want to sip bourbon, right? Although I'm the guy in the corner sipping bourbon, smoking a cigar. But generally speaking, right, bourbon is more of a sipping after dinner, you know, or, you know, before dinner as an aperitif, right? Not a chugging kind of cocktail, right? Unless you're doing shots of Boilermakers, I guess, alongside your beer.
Unless you're a Peaky Blinder. I don't know if anybody watches that. That's what inspired me.
No kidding.
Yes, it's a show. Anyway,
Yes, it is.
They drink a ton, and it's funny to watch.
Oh, great. And
I
they
have a
sip bourbon on the
question.
show? Yes, Sally.
It's so smooth. Is it true that the length of the aging contributes to the smoothness?
Well, the length of the aging contributes to the smoothness. Also, the alcohol content can contribute to the smoothness. I find sometimes that spirits that are higher in alcohol are actually smoother, contrary to what you would think.
Really?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Sure. So aging has a lot to do with it. So bourbon, in order to be bourbon, has to be aged at least 2 years to be called a straight bourbon. If it's aged less than 4 years, you have to actually put on the bottle how long it was aged. This is called a straight bourbon, so we know it's been aged at least for 2 years and more than 4 because it doesn't tell us on the label. What it does tell us is it was finished in port wine barrels, which is becoming more and more a common practice of making a great spirit, giving it its proper age, and then just before bottling, in this case 3 to 6 months, they use 60-gallon barrels from Portugal that were made from French oak that were used to make ruby port in. And it's not to change the flavor of the bourbon or to make it taste like port. What it's supposed to do is help improve some of the nuances in the bourbon, right? So right away you can see this wonderful color, this sort of almost copper tone to it, right? A lot of that comes from the inside of the barrel, right? That's where it's going to get its color from. In this particular wine too, you'll wine. Look at me, I'm 2 sips and already I don't even know what I'm drinking anymore, right?
Hits you quick.
So in the nose, you get some subtle notes of vanilla, maybe a little maple. Actually, get a little sort of a raisinated quality just in the nose. And unlike wine, where you want to stick your nose right in the glass, you don't want to do that with spirits because of the alcohol content. You'll actually burn your nose because you're going to get all that. You're going to put your nose in deep and inhale. You're going to get all that alcohol into you. You don't want to do that.
Right.
Just subtle aromas around your nose, right? And then you go in for that taste. I get a lot of ripe fruit. I get a little vanilla. And I get a little bit of actually, when I taste it, I get some toast, kind of toasty flavors in there. And actually, in the finish, I get a little bit of bitter chocolate.
Oh,
Wow.
I taste a little banana in the back
A
of my
little
throat.
banana. That's what I would call that ripe fruit. Sure,
Yes.
sure,
Right.
absolutely, absolutely.
And why is it sweeter? So much sweeter than
port?
like a.
Well, it has a lot to do with the aging. So they char the inside of the barrels to be called bourbon in the U.S. It has to be new American oak barrels, never used before. New American oak barrels, charred on the inside. Okay, so they're burned on the inside. The amount of char is determined by the brewmaster, how much char he wants on the barrel. What is charring? Just like it is with your steak or your cookies that you burned in the oven, whatever. You're caramelizing the natural sugars, right?
Blasphemy.
So you're caramelizing the natural sugars in the wood, right? That's going to lend this beautiful color and the sweetness and the flavor to the bourbon.
Now, did you say that in the American ones don't use the repurposed barrels?
No, it has to be new American barrels. They can only be used once. After that, then they're turned into something else. They can be used for wine or
Some breweries are using them.
breweries are using them, right? It's great that you see a lot of this in the industry, this sharing of things, because to be called bourbon in the U.S., you can only use the barrel once. So once they've used it to age bourbon, they can't use it anymore to age bourbon. It has to be used for other things. Now they can finish the bourbon in a used barrel. In this case, they're finishing it in a used port barrel, but they can't do that initial aging process in a used barrel. That has to be a new barrel, right? So here they've chosen the finished. To finish it in the port wine barrels.
Well, and Chef, you introduced me to one of my favorite rums, which is aged in a bourbon barrel. Correct? That's
My favorite rum
Caniche?
too.
Yes,
Caniche
yes.
XO.
Right, absolutely. And you see that a lot with rums being aged in used barrels. So it's kind of fun. I love what's happening in the industry. I tasted recently a rum, no, it was a Balvenie Scotch they called their Caribbean cask, and it was aged in used rum casks.
Oh, wow.
And what it did to bring out, we were talking about the ripe fruit flavors of this, the bananas you had suggested, Lynn. The rum casks brought out the nuances of the fruit in the Scotch.
Nice.
Okay, but we're not tasting Scotch. We're tasting bourbon. So back to the bourbon
Sorry.
table.
That's right. Oh, you're talking about beer too.
Angel's Envy, great distillery in Kentucky. This is a Kentucky bourbon founded by Lincoln Henderson. Lincoln Henderson, one of the inaugural inductees into the Bourbon Hall of Fame, really one of the forerunners of Kentucky bourbon, 1938 to 2013.
Right.
He was, when he was with Brown-Forman, he created the brand Gentleman Jack and also Woodford Reserve, which many people know. Angel's Envy was his independent project that he went off on his own before he passed. And funny name, funny idea behind the name. So when you age the bourbon in barrel, you lose about 5% to evaporation. And in the industry, they call that the angel's share. Where does it go? Right, it goes up there into the clouds, right? It's the angel's share.
Right.
Lincoln named his bourbon the Angel's Envy because it was the part left behind that they really wish they had. Finished in
5% 's
port
not
barrels,
enough.
all that aging, right? They never
right.
got to taste the finished project. So they have their share, and we have what is the Angel's Envy. Really delicious.
That's clever.
Yep, that is.
Great. Let's move on to taste the next one. And this is Bullet Bourbon. These are both Kentucky bourbons. And with the Bullet Bourbon, and they produce several different bourbons, this is their barrel strength, which I'm tasting for the first time.
Yeah.
Barrel strength or cask strength, as you may see on labels, means that it wasn't diluted. Okay, so what happens is, like with the Angel's Envy, they want a certain proof, I think it's 86.6% proof, their finished product to be the same all the time, right? So when it's done with its aging and it's finished in the port barrels, they dilute it with Kentucky limestone filtered water right to that 86.6 proof range to get exactly what they're looking for in a finished product.
Okay.
When you do barrel strength or cask strength, you see that on a label, it's right out of the barrel. Right out of the cask, no dilution. Tends to be higher in alcohol, and they'll vary from batch to batch. They're usually limited production. You buy this, you love it, you put it on your bar, you finish it eventually. A year later, you go buy another bottle. It's going to be slightly different.
Oh, wow.
Right? It's not the same all the time.
So it says cask on it? Is
It does. In this case, it says barrel strength right on the bottle.
Oh, barrel strength. Okay.
Right on the bottle, yep. And
Okay.
so we can actually show you right there, if it gets into focus a little bit. And it's not going to. Okay.
So it did.
So this is barrel strength, right?
And is this what they refer to? I know all my Virginia friends used to refer to having a bourbon and branch, and bourbon and branch water, and they would be a specific type of bourbon, which I would imagine is what you're talking about. They would dilute it a little. Sure. Whether it's regular bourbons, I'm not used to that.
Right. So probably before cask strength or barrel strength became popular, that was probably what they did.
Yeah.
Was they diluted it themselves using their own particular water.
Branch water, yeah.
So that's really interesting. Okay.
I feel like you can see a difference maybe even on the cup and the way that like it falls. I don't know, maybe because of the dilution, whether one's...
Certainly the Bullet is darker in the cup than the Angel's Envy. It's more of a medium amber color than that lighter copper color, right? Well, let's go in for a sip.
Caramel.
That is delicious.
You taste more of the
I
oak.
like that, yeah.
You get more of a sort of a sweet spice to it.
Yeah.
Right? Much more full-bodied.
Caramel,
right?
I taste.
Yeah. Caramel and spice.
And see how it almost feels smoother and creamier in the mouth? Higher alcohol, which would make you think, right, it's going to have that burn or not be as smooth.
Right.
But it's really smoother and creamier.
It is, absolutely.
The mouth, right? And the proof on this, so this is, let's take a quick look here. This is 122 proof.
Do we have a limo driver?
Significantly higher in proof than the Angel's Envy, but gosh, smooth, right? So
really good.
Amazingly smooth.
Yeah,
really
that's
amazingly
really
smooth,
good.
right? Bullet was started it's actually 1987 by Thomas Bullet, whose great-great-grandfather, Augustus Bullet, was a tavern owner in 1830. And he started producing his own straight Kentucky bourbon.
Wow.
And he did it for 30 years. And then he was making a delivery to Louisiana or something of his bourbon, and he disappeared. Never heard from again. So his great-great-grandson, Thomas Bullet, has rebirthed the product with the same sort of frontier ideas that his great-great-grandfather used, and really fabulous. They have a couple of different bourbons. Their regular bourbon, their 10-year aged bourbon, and this one here, the cask strength.
It's a paradox because I feel like you can taste, you immediately sense the higher alcohol, and yet it's smooth.
I don't.
Right?
I don't sense the higher alcohol. I don't know why. I don't. But like I can see it in the glass. It looks higher.
Sure, sure. And you know what? When you're tasting food, bourbon, wine, coffee, doesn't matter. There's no right or wrong answer. It's all what it is to you. What are you tasting? What are you enjoying?
Right.
What are the flavors you're getting, the nuances that you're getting? There's really no wrong answer. And the more you taste and be a little analytical about it, right? We go to a bar, we order a drink, you get your drink, you start drinking, you're talking to your friend, you're not paying any attention because you drink the drink all the time. You understand it, right? But when you're doing something different, sip it, taste it, be analytical, talk about it a little bit, either within your own head or whoever you're drinking with.
Right.
And if you do that every time you taste, everything that you taste, eat, or drink, you'll find that you too will expand your palate, which is what FoodSpace is all about, expanding our palate.
Yes.
So this is the bullet, you said?
This is the bullet, right?
Not related to the San Francisco Mustang cop who... No?
No, not to my knowledge.
It's a movie.
Right, okay, Augustus Bullet, 1830, there we go, right? So with the Angel's Envy, that is the mash bill, it's called, which is how much grain they use. To be a bourbon in the U.S. has to be at least 81%, no, I'm sorry. It has to be at least 61% corn. To be bourbon in the U.S. Then they can use wheat, they can use rye, they can use barley, or any combination thereof, and any percentages they want, but at least 61% corn.
So no wonder there's so much variety and taste. I didn't realize you could use so many different grains.
Sure, different grains.
Cool.
So in the case of the Angel's Envy, they actually use 72% corn, and then they use 18% rye and 10% malted barley. With the Bullet, they don't tell us the mash bill, but they do call it a high rye bourbon.
Okay.
Which would make me tend to think they're probably putting in the minimum amount of corn they can to still be a bourbon in the U.S. and then blending in a lot more rye.
Now, you say bourbon in the U.S. I don't know of any bourbons outside the U.S. Is that now a common thing?
Well, so, gosh, we could do a whole show on bourbon outside the U.S. Not enough time to do it today. But
next show.
But
Yeah, sign me up again.
These bourbon regulations are about bourbon sold in the U.S.
Okay.
Bourbon sold in the European Union or other places of the world can be, they have different laws. It can be sort of anything it wants to be. An American distiller can make bourbon and use just 40% corn and export it only. And still call it bourbon in the European Union, but he can't sell it in the U.S. or Canada as bourbon unless it's at least 61%.
But they all have this great smoky taste,
right?
And so
Which
that's,
comes from the inside of the barrel.
Right. So that's American, or do the other bourbon makers also do the smoky barrels?
Well, that's really more American because we have the laws that really decide what it has to be, right?
That's sort of random. Why do they tell the people how to create their bourbon? I don't get it.
Well, I think it kind of protects it. You know, just like well, if you're going to be in France and you're going to make Burgundy, you've got to use Pinot Noir. Right, or Chardonnay if it's white. And if you didn't know that, right, it sort of lessens the credibility of the wine. I think it's a lot the same way. Otherwise, people would be producing vodka-like product and calling it bourbon. But it's really not. So,
but do you know what's a little concerning? Because I'm over the top with health, is the corn. What about genetically modified corn in the U.S.? So I would say I would choose the second one with possibly less corn just for health reasons. I know that sounds silly, but that's like a big thing is everybody wants to stay away from genetically modified anything. And so corn's like the biggest thing in the U.S. So you wonder, does it translate into the product, or, you know, is this one healthier than the other just because they're using less?
Well, this is our motto for today, isn't it?
Right. It's all about health.
Making healthy
making bourbon more healthy,
yes.
right? So that's a really good question, Marie, that I can't answer for you.
Yeah,
so,
right. No,
I bet we can do a little research online and find out what their sources of corn are.
Well, to me, having the government tell you how to make your bourbon is kind of like having an art teacher telling you how to draw a tree.
Right. Bottom line is it tastes good, right?
Oh, yeah, it does.
We have a libertarian on board.
Oh, wait, one last question. Price points. Can you tell us that, or can you not?
They're both probably in the $60 to $70 range.
Okay.
I believe I paid for them retail here in Florida.
Okay.
Right? So drink better bourbon, right?
Right.
It's a little bit of you get what you pay for.
Yes.
Right? You see a bourbon on sale for $29.99. Great. Mix it with your ginger ale.
Right.
These bourbons you want to drink neat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice.
Marie and Lynn, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
That's all for FoodSpace for our bourbon tasting, and we look forward to you joining us on live stream again soon for another episode of FoodSpace. #expand your palate. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.